Everyone has fears, especially consultants. Some people are afraid of dying, some people are afraid of ducks. But as Epictetus said, man is not disturbed by things, but by the views he takes of them. And for me, like many others, I thought I needed to be an expert before I dived into consulting and triple my income. But realistically, that's just a distortion that your brain tells you to keep you safe in your perm role. In this video, I'm going to break down the 3 biggest fears that I had to overcome in my 12 years of cyber consulting and give you a super easy framework to do the exact same thing. So let's get into it. Now, when it comes to consulting, I find the initial hesitation usually stems from one of these 3 fears. A fear of failure, which is that you're going to end up on the street. Imposter syndrome, which leads to failure, your career being ruined and you ending up on the street. Or the fear of not knowing everything, which is failure, imposter syndrome, and still ending up on the street. There was a time where I experienced all 3 of them and more. So let's start with a story of my first day in consulting. And I really don't want to go back to that day. I'll start by saying this. Nobody uses a toilet more than a consultant on their first day, and it's not for the reason that you think. So here we are one sunny Monday morning 10 years ago, and I made my first approach to a massive media company in London to help them enforce their security posture. I was sold by the consulting agency that I worked for at the time as an expert in XYZ. Using a product that I've never actually used outside of my home lab on an operating system I'd literally never touched, which was Linux. So for those of you who aren't technically fluent, that would be like sending a plumber to stop a leak at the president's house while having never touched a pipe or having an understanding of leaks. And this is where the whole throwing yourself into the deep end thing can kind of backfire if you don't have the tools to deal with it properly. But here we are. So it's 8 a.m. and the meeting starts at the client's site. The objective is to discuss the requirements to build them a dashboard to revolutionize their security team's ability to respond. In an instant, all 3 of the fears strike me at once. Fear of failure, fear of not knowing everything, and imposter syndrome. In the room is a group of men dressed in expensive suits talking about things that I pretend to understand. But inside my head, there's a raging band of farm animals all attacking one another in a violent fit of panic. One of them's even speaking Korean. It's not looking good as the room falls silent. My heart beats so hard that I can actually hear the blood pulsing behind my ears. Have you ever had that? And I think to myself, fuck, I'm about to be exposed and end up on the street. So not hearing a word that any of them say, I nod my head, which is the universal sign of understanding, and I manage to stammer the words, I'll get right on that. So I walk back to my desk believing that a stroke is imminent, and from the moment I had 2 choices to make. I could either crumble and flee, or I could go to the toilet to buy myself some time to think. So I chose the toilet and wandered off with my phone clutched between my white knuckles. I call the engagement manager for the consulting firm and he laughs at me. He tells me that the toilet thing is super common for consultants on their first day, especially when they're taking risks. So I laugh, but immediately the dread returns and I think, what next? He tells me to call the only other person in their company who knows the tech that we're doing to get some advice. He's also a stranger from a foreign land just like me. So I phone him and I realize that I don't remember a single word that anyone said during that meeting that we just had, all because of those goddamn farm animals. So I go back to my desk looking like I just met Satan in the bathroom, and for the first time in my life I was in a situation where I had to use my brain to build something under such immense pressure. Because even though I'd been a pianist and a DJ and a producer and all that stuff, which I performed in front of tons of people, it's a completely different process because music is creative. And the last thing you want to do is think. You just go with the flow. You don't want to think, you just flow with it. But with this, especially technical stuff, you need to think critically under pressure. So I know approaching this guy and saying to him, I didn't actually listen in this meeting is an obvious no. So I thought of a cunning plan. I asked him to draw me a rough sketch of the dashboard on paper so I can get it as accurate as possible. I'm a genius, I think to myself. So I go up to him, he draws this thing for me with tons of detail on his deadpan face. He hands it back to me. So I thank him and go back to my desk and my heart celebrates for a moment before realizing that I still have to implement this thing. So I take a photo and I head back to the toilet as quickly as possible to speak to the guy that I spoke to before. Turns out that he would be my future mentor, but we haven't reached that stage in our relationship yet. He tells me of this mystical community where you post questions and people answer because it's actually gamified with real-world incentives within that company itself. Bingo, that's my solution. So I upload an image of the requirements to that community and I ask for help. I get a response and I do my best to make friends with whatever strangers I can on there. And one guy ends up, again, laughing because he'd been in that situation before. And he helped me build the whole thing. So every day for the next 2 weeks, after work, I would go home, speak to this guy, figure out how to build it in my own time, and then come back and deliver it piece by piece to the client. ended up actually ending really well and coming back to that client over and over again for the job that I did. Because by the end of it, I actually learned how to do the thing and learned a whole bunch about consulting. So it really paid off, even though the beginning was a complete shit show. So do you have any guesses as to why I felt those 3 fears? Fear of failure, because failure was highly imminent. The fear of not knowing everything, because I didn't actually know anything. And imposter syndrome, because I was literally an imposter. So that's where all of the power in this lies, is that despite the fact that I was all of these things, I still chose how I respond to it. In that moment, I could have gone home, or I could have tried to figure something out. And thankfully, I chose the option to try and figure out, which you should always do despite your fear. So this is the part where I'm going to actually give you a framework on how to deal with this stuff, because it's bound to come up. This bullshit happens to me over and over again, despite the fact that I've been doing this for 12 years. I've just gotten so good at shooting the thoughts down immediately that they don't bother me or even deter me in the slightest from just taking risks. So let's get into it. So the first thing that we need to do is set the context of this. And you need to remember that the more you understand something, the more you can change the way you think or feel about it. So what you do is you need to analyze your thoughts, and you do that by analyzing these irrational thoughts that pop into your head. And it's a really simple process. So I'll give you the process, and then we will address the thoughts one by one. So the first thing that you want to do is define the fear accurately. This is going to help you understand its meaning, what it means specifically to you, and what you're actually afraid of happening as a result of whatever this risk is that you're about to take. Step 2 is to stack the evidence. You get objective data against this thing. You don't want to use your feelings here, because feelings are little fucking liars and they just want to rob you. Then step 3 is to take the objective data and turn it into an objective understanding for yourself. So you see which side of the scale the evidence falls on, and that determines how you act. So let's break this down for each fear and talk about this framework. Fear number 1, imposter syndrome. So the first thing that we need to do is define the fear, and that's the internal belief that you're not as competent as others perceive you to be, despite evidence of previous success. And this is where shit can get kind of weird, because I just told you to stack the evidence for greatness, but imposter syndrome exists despite that evidence. And what's actually happening here is something called discounting the positives. It's basically ignoring your own success or chalking it up to luck rather than your own skill. And there's 2 harsh truths to this. 1, just because you have evidence doesn't mean irrational fears just magically disappear. Sometimes they do, but a lot of the time, the point of gathering all of this evidence is actually just to acknowledge that there's no truth behind your current thinking, so that you can reframe it and then act despite the fear. And that is the really magic sauce in this, is that you are going to act despite being afraid of the thing. So let's give you a working example. You're about to lead a critical project and your brain whispers, "I'm not qualified to be here. Everyone will realize I'm a fraud." So this is what I would do in that situation. 1, I'm going to identify the fear. So I'm going to call out that thought as the dirty bastard that it is. It's imposter syndrome, not a fact at this point. Then I'm going to challenge it. Is there any evidence that I don't belong in the room, or I don't belong on this cloud project? Have I been working in industrial waste for the last 10 years, or have I been a cloud engineer? Now, if you've been in industrial waste, obviously the evidence goes up in this field, but if you've been in cloud engineering, it goes up in this field. What have you achieved that contributes to you actually being on this cloud project? Do you have certs, any knowledge, any experience, accolades, endorsements? Basically things that prove you are who you say you are. And then step 3 is you're going to replace the thought with facts. So I know I don't have to pay attention to this thought. I can choose how to follow the facts. And so far, based on the evidence that I just stacked for this imposter syndrome, the evidence shows that I'm not an imposter. And it's really just that simple. The hard part is where it takes self-control to not spiral down into this rabbit hole of what if I'm wrong, what if that. So catching yourself in the moment and then circling back to the truth over and over again. And the ironic thing is that most highly skilled people still get imposter syndrome, and it's because they can't stop this spiral of going round and round and not paying attention to the facts, but rather the way that they feel, because they don't address their thoughts. And there's a whole bunch of other imposter busting tactics that we can use when we're dealing with this. So you could talk to yourself like a friend. Say, for instance, a friend came up to you who you knew was amazing at their job, and they said, "Oh, I'm just going to be really shit at this project I'm about to be on." What would you say to them? So if you treat yourself in the same way, you can find different angles to approach your thoughts and break them down. The other thing that you can do is research. A lot of people recommend that, and it definitely helps. But the problem with that is that you can also get lost in a spiral of needing to have endless research to make yourself feel validated to actually do the job. So just be careful when you're doing research. The third thing you can do for imposter syndrome is to start small and start big. If you don't have a lot of evidence that suggests you are great at what you want to do, you can start on something smaller or look back to the smaller things that you did in your life that still took a courageous leap and use that as evidence. Step 4 is that you need to remember everyone has imposter syndrome. It doesn't matter how good you are at a thing. You can still walk into a room that's bigger than you and feel like an imposter, because that's how we grow. Which brings us on to step 5 of it's a growth signal. If you're constantly comfortable, it means that you're never growing. And if you're never growing, then you're probably going to be extremely uncomfortable one day in the future. So take it as a growth signal, and that alone will really help you scale with this thing, because it means that you are in the right room. You're in a room for growth. And then point 6 is that you should do it anyway. You act despite the fact that even if you are an imposter, you can still choose to do this thing. And there is one caveat to that. If you're going to be an imposter and the likelihood of you failing is very high, and it's going to cost someone a ton of money and a ton of time, you probably shouldn't do it. The reason why I had no issue doing this thing for the engagement that I was on is because the company that I went to is obviously backed up by the consultancy that I was a perm consultant for at the time. So even if I screwed something up or I walked off site, they would be liable to just send someone and do the job. My career would probably be ruined, but the company itself would be fine. So in that instance, I didn't care. You should never really do something that is going to rob someone of something unless you know somehow that you can pull it off. So if you actually are an imposter and all of the evidence suggests that you are one, you have to realize the first thing that, one, you're in for massive growth. It's going to happen if you can pull this thing off. But the way that you address it now is not the same as addressing an irrational fear. You have a rational fact that you are an imposter, but you chose to do this despite knowing that you weren't ready, and that's okay too. It just means that you need to change your mindset. You're going to have to use a set of tools to do this. So you would use things like your community and network, the internet, or AI. And if you don't have those things, you need to find those things to help you get the job done. But another thing about being an actual imposter is that you're not just going to magically rock up on site one day like within 12 hours. That's not how it works. There's always going to be a lead up time to getting to site, which means that you can prepare for these things before you actually get there. You can develop a plan of action and a plan of preparedness to get you done, so that you're not in a place of hopelessness. You're now in a place of action. And you would do that with one of the 4 tools that I mentioned previously, the community, the AI, all of that stuff. It can help you get those things done. Now we get on to fear 2, which is the fear of failure. I don't know a single person who doesn't have a fear of failure. I think it just dissipates over the time like the rest of them. The definition of that is the anxiety of not meeting expectations, leading to perceived loss of value or an opportunity. So everyone is afraid of this thing, and it always happens when they're trying to start something new. They're obviously afraid of failure, but this is how you build that resilience. And the biggest distortions here are fortune telling and catastrophizing. Basically assuming that everything is going to go to shit because you might not know how to do it, or there might be something that you missed. Basically, you're going to fail. And for this, I like to use something called the why framework. Again, it's super simple to get the problem solved using the why framework. The first thing that you do is just simply ask yourself, why do you think you're going to fail? If you've done zero prep, then it's probably a rational fear with some evidence that you might fail. But that actually makes it actionable. You're being smart by identifying this gap, which means that you can bridge that gap. So step 2 of this is, have you done everything in your power not to fail? Have you prepared for the role? Do you understand what's expected of you? Have you got a process set out? Have you learned the skills that you need to get the job done? And if yes, there's literally nothing else that you can do except execute and accept that failure is still possible, because you can't just control everything. And then step 3 to this is, ask yourself, is it reasonable to never fail? And the answer is obviously no, only if you've never tried anything ever. So when you do fail, it's feedback. Your process was flawed, someone else did better than you, something beyond your control happened. Either way, there's value in that experience of failure. So there are a few things that you can do to make yourself failure-proof, to get over it a lot faster, because this fear is going to be there. And again, you have to act despite this fear. So what we need are strategies to help us deal with it. And the first thing that you can do, just like imposter syndrome, is to stack past wins. So do you have any evidence of previous successes? And even if you don't have something relating directly to a cloud migration, you will have done something before that. Did you pass a really stressful interview? Did you do anything else that was really stressful where you held your cool and figured out solutions? Then the next thing that you need to do is develop a plan B, which reduces the perceived impact. So you're always going to have different strategies to deal with the same kind of problem. You want different solutions. Just like if you were going to do a cloud migration, you wouldn't put together a report that didn't include any risks, including a rollback strategy. You want to have a playback for when shit ultimately hits the fan. And you do the same thing on a personal level. Like, if I go to this site and this happens, I'm going to have this response, or I'm going to speak to this person. Basically, you develop a plan that helps you deal with the fact that there are gaps to make your chance of failure less likely. And then step 3, specifically for dealing with a client, to avoid this massive controversy if you do ultimately have a failure, is that you would set the expectations beforehand. So sometimes failure is part of the job. It doesn't always happen, but it can happen. And you want to make sure that your client knows that and that you've built a response for it. So again, you would have a rollback strategy for this client thing that you're about to do. If it's a cloud migration, you're going to tell them these risks. You're going to say, if we do this, this could break. So we need to have a strategy on dealing with that. So just by setting that expectation, you set completely different expectations for the client, which means there's less stress on you because you now have this plan to move forward. And that brings us on to fear number 3, which is the fear of not knowing everything. And the definition of this is that concern that knowledge gaps will ultimately expose you, questioning your expertise or authority. And this thing still haunts me constantly. No matter what I do, anything in life, I feel like because I'm a perfectionist, I need to know everything about something. But if I don't know one thing and a client asks me a question, my brain automatically tells me that I know nothing, which means failure, which means all of that street stuff. And this is just classic all or nothing thinking. So you need to use something called the knowledge gap framework here. And it's quite similar to imposter syndrome. You can see how all of these things are kind of interlinked. You want to stack the evidence of what you do know and prepare for what you don't know, and then create a baseline of truth somewhere in the middle with a path to bridge those gaps. Part 2 of this is to do a reality check. You need to do just like before. Have you done everything possible to prepare for this? Because then obviously you've done all you can. But most importantly, you need to ask yourself if it's reasonable for someone to know everything. And the answer is immediately no. Companies don't expect you to know everything, only you do. If you go to a company and you just keep saying, I don't know, obviously that's pretty shit. But there are tons of ways around it. And if you are prepared, you're not going to have to keep doing that, because if you're prepared, logically, you should be able to answer a few questions. And the stuff that you don't know, you can use things like, I actually just need to find out. They might have changed the version number, or I just want to make sure. I don't want to give you an answer that might have changed since the last time we did this. As long as you're not constantly saying no and you're reframing the conversation, it's perfectly fine to not know something. So if we look at another strategy for not knowing something, you can just ask a whole bunch of clarifying questions. And this is super important because you're going to use active listening and mirroring to do this kind of stuff. The first thing that you do is you spend all of your time listening, because the more they talk, the more avenues you have to ask questions about things that you don't know. And when you don't know something, you just mirror what they say. If they're asking you for a low-level diagram for one of their cloud products, you can say a low-level diagram, and then they're going to elaborate on that. It's such a super simple thing. And obviously, you would use it on more precise topics. I'm just giving you a point of discussion here. But the more questions that you ask, the more data points you have for asking further questions. And when you do that, you take this really big, vague thing that you might not understand, and you make it much smaller so that you can start tackling these little building blocks that will ultimately get you where you want to go. Another thing you can do is obviously use your network and your community for real-time answers. So everyone does that. They're going to use AI. They're going to use Google. Everyone's been doing it. Historically, maybe in the late 90s, early 2000s, people were literally reading manuals. I know my oldest brother was literally reading the manual on the way to a client. So things have changed, and it's become a lot easier for us to find answers. I would use Perplexity nowadays. And then finally for this, you can use baseline knowledge to try and troubleshoot your way through a problem. So generally, most of the time, the problems are going to make themselves evident in the logs. If someone asks you a troubleshooting question, the first thing you do is say, I would check the logs. And then you build up from there. What do the logs tell you? Oh, it's pointing to this. Maybe I would look at that. Basically help them get to an answer without actually needing to give them a direct answer immediately. So that's another strategy that people use all the time. Then point 4 is that you want to build confidence through evidence. So how often have you figured out unknowns before? Surely you have done something you didn't know before and still pulled it off. So I use this one a lot. It really helps me. If I think I don't know something, I think back to my first gig, which was fucking terrible. And I think if I could deal with all of that stuff with absolutely no knowledge, no confidence, no network, and no friends in the space, 12 years later now, there's literally nothing I can't do because I've literally done everything at this point. So you can see I have a lot of evidence to suggest that I'm capable of doing this thing. And even if you don't have that yet, you again stack the smaller things to build the bigger thing. You're not going to magically wake up one day on a client site. That's not going to happen either, which means that you will always have time to prepare for the stuff, and you can use your baseline knowledge to help you talk intelligently through any gaps that you have. So if we look at the bottom line, these 3 fears all lead to the same place in your brain: failure, living under a bridge with a cardboard box. That's just how it is. So the truth is that your brain is just trying to keep you safe in a shitty situation instead of letting you risk temporary discomfort for a permanent improvement. And it's really hard for some people to understand that, because they would rather not take the risk because they think that the failure is far worse than the risk they would take. But realistically, not taking risk is the same thing as failing, because by not doing the thing that you want to do, you failed before you've even tried. So why would you let yourself be in that situation when there are so many tools nowadays to actually get ahead and beat the fears that you have? So let's recap this framework quite simply. Point number 1, define the fear precisely. You have to define your fears. You have to know why they are there so that you can understand them so that they don't stop you from making progress. Step number 2, stack objective evidence against this thing, regardless of where it is. If the evidence is in favor of the fear actually being true, then it's not irrational anymore, and you need to find a way to solve any knowledge gaps or anything that does make the fear truthful. And if there is no evidence to support the fear, you need to label it as an irrational fear and then build a strategy and a framework around it, like I discussed, to get you to the next step. Same paths, but just different avenues of dealing with them. And then step 3, you're going to act based on the facts, not on your feelings. You need to act despite the fear, despite the way your heart beats, despite all of that stuff that feels uncomfortable. You need to act because you know that these are just fears and you have the strategies to get over them. Because while you're sitting there being afraid of all of this stuff like being an imposter or being a failure, someone with half the skill that you have but twice the guts is going to get closing deals, they're going to make more money, and they're going to do the things that you ultimately want to do. When the only reason that you're not doing it is because you haven't taken the time to address these fears, and these people either didn't have the fears or give enough of a shit to care about having fear. Stop letting your brain keep you broke. Realistically, the only real danger is staying where you are. If you want to find out more about my journey and how I got to where I am today, you can watch the video in the link above here. If you want a community that will really help support you on your journey and get you where you want to go as fast as possible, check the link in the description below for my community. Otherwise, leave some comments below so I can find out what videos you guys want me to make, and I'll see you in the next one.